50% tariffs on many Indian exports into the United States, now in effect after a sharp hike from the 25% that took effect earlier this month. The US president giving as his reason India's presumed dependence on Russian oil, which Donald Trump says funds the Kremlin's war in Ukraine. Sectors bearing the brunt include engineering goods, garments, jewellery and even shrimp. As of 2024, India's gem and jewellery industry made up around 34% of exports to the US. But key sectors like pharmaceuticals, smartphones and energy have been spared. The US is India's largest export market, and analysts warn the latest levies could result in a 0.6% hit to GDP. From bromance to breakup, once warm relations between Mr. Trump and Narendra Modi appearing to hit a cold patch, with deadlocked talks failing to secure India any reprieve on tariffs. New Delhi had started as a front-runner to strike a deal with Washington. Narendra Modi in February hailing the US-India, quote, mega partnership during a meeting with Donald Trump in Washington, and agreeing to work towards a trade deal by autumn, while also aiming to expand bilateral trade to $500 billion by 2030. Our trade talks looked on course for progress in March, with visits to both Delhi and Washington. Indian Trade Minister Piyush Goyal made the trip to the US to meet Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. American officials then visited India's capital. The US Vice President touring India in April, that saw agreement by both sides on terms for talks. Indian officials expressing hope a trade deal could be signed by the 9th of July. That was the deadline then. But cracks would emerge by May, India refuting a claim by Mr. Trump that the US had brokered a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. This, of course, following a terrorist attack in Indian-administered Kashmir in April. By June, reports had surfaced of trade talks under pressure from disagreements over agricultural import duties. Mr. Modi telling a rally in Odisha on the 20th of June that he had turned down an invitation from the US president to visit Washington. Mr. Trump sticking to his line of an, quote, impending big trade deal with India. India's trade minister standing firm in July, though, maintaining India would not strike any deal just to meet deadlines, and that national interest is, quote, supreme. In a bid to break the deadlock, a fifth round of negotiations would proceed in Washington. But talks still at stalemate. The US president slapping a 25% tariff on Indian imports on the 31st of July. This would take effect a week from then, on the 7th of August, with the threat of a further 25% if India persisted in what the US saw as the purchase of Russian oil. But India hitting back, slamming as unfair additional tariffs over Russian oil purchases, refusing to make concessions on the defense of national interests. US delegation's trip to New Delhi late August cancelled. White House advisor Peter Navarro ramping up the rhetoric on India buying Russian oil, only serving to help Moscow fund its war in Ukraine. That brings us to today, with New Delhi confronted with US tariffs at a punishing 50%. Mr. Modi's first trip to China in 7 years due this week, being seen as a signal that India is moving to diversify its partnerships amid growing pressure from Washington. The Director General and CEO from the Federation of Indian Export Organizations explains how Delhi could see these tariffs from the US as a compelling reason to deepen cooperation in trade with Beijing.
One of the silver lining which has come out of the tariff war is the increasing realization on the company to de-risk and diversify. So in the process, we will be much more willing to have more market access in China, increase our trade with China, increase our exports with China. A lot of imports from China is happening. That's probably the demand of the Indian industry. At the same time, we should also look into increasing our exports to China in a big way.
And for more on this story, we're joined by Rebecca Bundhun in Mumbai and Nick Harper in Washington, D.C. Rebecca, let's start with you. We just heard that India, one of its ways to react to these tariffs is to diversify its trade relationships, including with China. India, of course, has made clear its position on these tariffs that take effect today. We've heard Narendra Modi in the last few weeks giving his his stand on tariffs from the United States. What more has the Indian government said since tariffs took effect today?
Well, India's Commerce Ministry has yet to officially release a statement in reaction to today's tariffs coming into effect, those additional US tariffs taking it up to 50%. However, reportedly, a ministry official has said that it's looking at offering financial assistance to those exporters that will be very badly affected by Trump's move. And it's also looking at working with these exports to try to help them diversify to other markets. Now we have heard from Prime Minister Narendra Modi earlier this week. He's been talking about India's resilience. He's also been saying that India needs to focus on becoming more self-reliant on its domestic market. And he says that other economies are working in their own self-interest. And India's ambassador to Russia earlier this week said that India would continue to buy oil from wherever it gets the best rates as it continues to try to meet the energy security needs of its 1.4 billion people. So certainly all these comments have really been on the national interests of India and trying to protect that. And India's really not expected to change that stance at all.
Rebecca, 25% was pain enough. 50% from some analysts, they're saying that effectively kills trade between the US and India. We could see a deal that could lower that tariff rate, but until that happens, how are local manufacturers and exporters affected by these tariffs planning to deal with the pain until there's any reprieve from that pain?
So economists say that the wider economy can potentially absorb the economic impact, although it will have an effect, these larger tariffs. However, there are certain sectors that will be very, very badly impacted. Those include gems and jewellery, textiles, car parts. These will all be sectors that will be dramatically affected, and they're looking at ways to try and get around this. Now, companies say that this could include transshipments, for example, and also looking at sharing the greater costs on these import duties among the exporter and the importer. However, some business owners also point out that many American customers are simply going to take their business elsewhere now because other countries have become much more competitive with India's import duties rising in the US. Now, the problem here as well is that they point out that a lot of these sectors are very labour intensive. They employ a lot of people, often in manual jobs. I spoke to Sanjay Jain, who runs a textiles company in India, and he was particularly concerned about this. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
I would say it's a disaster for the Indian labor-intensive industry in the short term because US is the largest market in the world. And many of the small Indian companies, MSMEs, are 100% only dependent on USA. And the impact is not only on that company, the impact trickles down to the labor, it trickles down to the suppliers, the vendors, the bankers, all the financiers, and also to their labor.
My hope is still that we would be able to find a resolution to this, but if not, then to a large extent, I think eventually the trade between these two countries, direct trade, would be largely dead.
Mr. Jain also pointed out that while larger companies might be able to adapt more easily and perhaps diversify to other markets, this often becomes very difficult for small and medium-sized businesses to try to change their business overnight and win new business. But members of the public seem to be a little bit more optimistic. They think that India can get through this, or they think that the matter will be resolved soon. Let's have a listen to what people in India had to say.
अमेरिका ही एक वर्ल्ड में बाजार नहीं है बेचने के लिए. पूरे ब्रह्मांड में एक अमेरिका ही प्लेस नहीं है जिसको हम एक्सपोर्ट कर सकते हैं. टैरिफ लगाए कोई दिक्कत नहीं, हमारे पास और भी विकल्प है.
एक्चुअली अपने मूवमेंट चलना चाहिए, इंडिया को अपने ही उस पे हिसाब से चलना चाहिए. ये नहीं सोचना चाहिए कि उसने क्या लगाया. हमें अपना देखना चाहिए, हमको उसको कैसे हैंडल करना है. उस पे आधार पे चलना चाहिए, क्योंकि 50% उसने लगा दिया। अभी आज के पेपर में आया तो वो पहले से सोच रहा है प्रेशर में ले लूं मोदी जी को।
डिप्लोमेटिकली अगर हम इसको करना चाहें तो हैंडल हो सकती है। वी शुड टॉक टू यूएसए अबाउट दिस के देखिए हमें आपसे इंपोर्ट एक्सपोर्ट दोनों होना है, तो दैट वे वी कैन कंपनसेट विद ईच अदर इफ दे एग्री टू दैट।
Trade talks between Washington and New Delhi effectively broke down a few weeks ago, and there's still no clarity on when the two countries might return to the negotiating table to try to work out some kind of a deal.
Thanks to Rebecca Bundhun there. Nick, let's bring you in. We're hearing from Rebecca that several voices in India saying they might take their business elsewhere if they get this kind of pressure from Washington. Of course, given that the US imports far more from India than it exports to India, that is conceivably less pain. Even so, there could be some impact on American businesses.
That's right, Wesu, and it's interesting to note that there are different ways that this will impact US companies. Bear in mind that many of the biggest US companies, about 2/3 of them, have offshoring operations in India, and that's something that they've built up over many years, and in many ways they made that change during Donald Trump's first term when we saw incredible tariffs against China. Many of those US companies changed the way that it did business overseas, moving their offshore locations from China to India. But now, with these tariffs against products coming in from India, they are having to bear the brunt of their offshoring relocation plans as a result of Donald Trump's changes in his first term. So a big impact for those very large US companies, but also importers of a vast array of Indian goods will be impacted. About $87 billion worth of Indian goods enter the United States each year. Things like gemstones and jewellery, very much at the top of the list there, but also generic pharmaceuticals that are imported and then sold here in the US, clothing and electronics goods, things that go into making smartphones, for example. And for those companies that are now importing those goods at a higher rate, it's a question of whether they absorb the costs or, more likely, pass them on to the consumers. And that could affect inflation here in the US. It could even affect the labour market here in the US as well. I think interesting to note that, of course, Donald Trump is doing all of this against India, he says, because New Delhi continues to buy cheap oil from Russia. But he hasn't targeted any other country that's doing the same thing. So, for example, China, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Brazil, all of them buy Russian energy as well. But at this stage, it is just against India. And it's interesting, polling shows that the majority of Americans, about 62%, agree with Donald Trump's plans of putting extra tariffs on India because of buying oil from Russia.
Oh, Nick, I'll pick you up on that. Switching tack slightly since you mentioned China. China facing tariff pressure as well, but in all these weeks and months, it has had very different leverage compared to India. Of course, it's a very differently structured economy as well, but in terms of negotiating tracks, it has also had a very different front from India has had with Washington. Where are we on the US and China reaching any kind of sustained agreement on tariffs and trade?
Well, seemingly nowhere nearer to any of that. We're currently on another 90-day pause. That was agreed on August the 11th. So 30% tariffs on Chinese goods entering the US, 10% on US goods entering in China. That's in effect at the moment, that pause on tariffs. But we do understand that there is a top Chinese negotiator here in Washington this week to meet with US officials. We don't know a great deal about it, but we know plenty of things that this meeting is not. This is not being seen as part of the formal negotiating between the two countries. The negotiator who's coming over, Li Chenggang, is not meeting the US Trade Representative Jameson Greer, and we're also told that he's not coming because the US has requested him. Now, there have been 3 rounds of formal negotiations in Europe. The last round ended up in that 90-day pause. So this seems to be another way of trying to push things in the direction of coming to some long-term agreement. But in many ways, as this isn't being seen as part of the formal negotiations, we may not see any concrete announcements coming out of the back of these meetings.
Thanks. Nick Harper there in Washington, D.C. and Rebecca Bundhun in Mumbai.